It was past midnight, and the apartment felt unusually still. The faint hum of the city outside was muffled by thick curtains, leaving only the quiet rhythm of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved from the kitchen to the living room. I had settled into the comfort of routine, a cup of tea in hand, a book open on the couch, the world reduced to the warmth of my small sanctuary. Then came the knock. Soft. Tentative. Almost hesitant. 3 light taps against the door jolted me out of the solitude I had grown so accustomed to. My heartbeat quickened, but it wasn't fear, it was curiosity, laced with a subtle, unidentifiable tension. At this hour, a visitor was unusual. Stranger still, it wasn't the usual building staff or neighbor dropping a late-night package. I opened the door slowly. Standing there, in the dim hallway lit by the faint glow of the overhead light, were 2 women. They belonged to the apartment across the hall, neighbors whose presence I had only noticed from brief glances in the hallway or through thin apartment walls. They were in their early 40s, carrying themselves with a quiet elegance that made the shadows of the hallway cling to them in an almost cinematic way. Both wore expressions of hesitation, tinged with purpose, like they had rehearsed this encounter in the back of their minds countless times. The taller one shifted her weight, her hand brushing against the edge of the doorframe, revealing the graceful poise of someone who had spent years moving through the world with quiet confidence. The other, slightly shorter, kept her hands clasped loosely in front of her, a subtle vulnerability hidden behind a composed smile. Their presence was magnetic, drawing my attention not with loud gestures or flashy appearances, but through the gentle insistence of being there, in the stillness of my midnight world. The hallway smelled faintly of jasmine and vanilla, a comforting aroma that seemed to settle into the space between us. Even from this distance, the scents were intimate, personal, as if carried from their home as a whisper rather than a perfume. The taller one spoke first, her voice calm but tinged with nervous energy. "We hope we're not disturbing you." The shorter one nodded slightly, her eyes scanning mine with quiet curiosity. I stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The act was simple, but the sensation of the moment lingered in my chest, the subtle heat of anticipation, the brush of the cool hallway air as they crossed the threshold, the faint weight of the unknown pressing softly against the edges of my awareness. It was a beginning I hadn't expected, a ripple across the calm surface of my evening. As they entered, I noticed the small, telling gestures, a hand briefly touching her own neck, a delicate tilt of the head, the way her fingers brushed a stray lock of hair away from her face. Simple movements yet charged with life, curiosity, and a quiet invitation. In that instant, the mundane apartment felt transformed, filled with the possibility of connection and the soft, electric thrill of something entirely new. The knock had been brief, but its echo lingered far longer than sound alone, an unexpected intrusion that promised a night I would not forget. Once they stepped inside, the quiet of my apartment seemed to embrace us, softening the edges of the night outside. The city's distant hum faded further, leaving only the warmth of the small living room and the soft glow of a single lamp. I motioned for them to sit on the couch, though they hesitated for just a heartbeat, as if negotiating whether comfort was permitted at this late hour. They finally sank into the cushions, graceful yet cautious, and I took the armchair opposite them, my cup of tea resting in my hands. At first, the conversation was careful, the kind that floats just above the surface. We spoke of trivial things, the strange creaks of the building at night, the annoyances of leaky faucets, the way streetlights cast odd shadows across the hallway. Their voices were calm, warm, and measured, but I sensed a subtle energy beneath their words, a quiet tension that seemed to ripple in the pauses between sentences. Every small gesture, the way one of them tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way the other's fingers traced the rim of her mug, felt magnified in the stillness. Gradually, the small talk began to open cracks into something deeper. The taller woman, her eyes reflecting the lamplight, spoke of her work, a job demanding patience and resilience, yet one that often left her feeling unseen. The shorter one shared a memory from childhood, a fragment of laughter shadowed by longing. Their words were simple, yet they resonated, pulling me closer into the orbit of their lives. I listened intently, offering the occasional nod or soft acknowledgement, though I realized my presence was doing more than listening. It was being a witness, a quiet anchor in their midnight world. There was a delicate intimacy in the room now, not of desire yet, but of recognition. I noticed the way their hands moved almost unconsciously, the gentle brush of fingertips as one handed the other a tissue, the subtle alignment of their bodies toward me as conversation deepened. Each movement was charged with a quiet life, a rhythm that I could feel in my own chest. Even the faint scent of their perfume, warm, floral, and slightly mysterious, seemed to swirl around the room, threading its way through the conversation. At one point, the taller woman laughed softly at a shared joke, and I caught the way her shoulder brushed mine for a fleeting second. It was nothing overt, nothing to alarm or confuse, yet it sent a small shiver of awareness through me. The shorter one's gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, and I found myself acutely conscious of the warmth of her presence. Every subtle movement, every quiet inflection of voice, seemed to carry an unspoken question: how far could this connection stretch without breaking the boundaries of propriety? Time became fluid. Minutes melted into an hour as the conversation deepened. They spoke honestly, vulnerably, revealing the small cracks in their otherwise composed exteriors. And I, in turn, felt my own hesitation soften, the walls around my own heart giving way to curiosity, empathy, and something quietly thrilling. By the time I noticed the clock, it was well past 1 in the morning. The world outside was still, but inside, a quiet spark had ignited, a sense of intimacy, trust, and a connection that neither words nor gestures alone could fully explain. The night had shifted, and I realized that this visit, unexpected as it was, had opened a door not just between apartments, but between hearts. The night had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that makes every small sound seem amplified. The gentle hum of the radiator, the faint rustle of leaves brushing the windowpane, even the soft settling of furniture as we shifted in our seats. The women across the hall had grown more comfortable, yet retained a poised elegance, like dancers who could step lightly into vulnerability without losing their balance. I found myself drawn in, listening to fragments of their lives unfold as though the dimly lit room were a confessional illuminated by nothing but trust and candlelight. The taller woman, her hair loosely pinned back, began recounting her career journey. Years of dedication, long nights, and moments of invisible triumph, all delivered with an understated grace that made her both formidable and quietly human. Her voice was steady, but there were cracks I could hear if I listened closely, tiny traces of doubt, of moments when the world had underestimated her. She spoke not to impress, but to share, and in doing so, invited me into the landscape of her life. The shorter woman's story was different, more intimate, tinged with a gentle sadness. She spoke of heartbreaks long past, of love that had slipped away, of the quiet loneliness that lingered even in crowded rooms. Her words were soft, measured, yet they carried weight. I noticed the way her fingers traced patterns on the rim of her mug as she spoke, as if the motion could steady both her hands and her emotions. There was a vulnerability in her posture, a small curve of her shoulders that hinted at the careful armor she wore around the world. As they spoke, I realized how much I had been observing without realizing, every small gesture, every inflection, every glance between them. The taller woman's eyes would flicker briefly toward the shorter one, a silent communication passing in microseconds, unnoticed by anyone but me. I could sense their bond, layered with decades of experience and unspoken understanding, and it fascinated me, the way age, confidence, and quiet vulnerability could coexist so harmoniously in one presence. The room seemed to shrink in a comforting way, drawing us closer without words. Their voices mingled with the soft rustle of fabric and the faint creak of the floorboards, creating an intimate orchestra that made the silence between sentences meaningful. I leaned forward, genuinely engaged, and noticed how subtly they mirrored my own movements, shoulders angled slightly toward me, hands adjusting in rhythm with mine, a brush of knee against knee under the low light. These small, unconscious gestures carried more than casual warmth. They hinted at a connection forming on a plane deeper than conversation alone. Even the sensory details seemed heightened, the soft scent of jasmine from one woman, the faint warmth of vanilla from the other, the way the lamplight caught the golden tones in their hair. The apartment felt alive, charged with attention and subtle desire, though nothing had been spoken. Each moment was a study in restraint and invitation, a slow unfolding of trust that felt almost sacred. By the time the conversation drifted into quieter topics, I felt that the apartment across the hall was no longer just a neighboring space. It was a window into lives rich with experience, depth, and unexpected vulnerability. And as I listened, I understood that the night was no longer simply about strangers knocking at midnight. It was about connection, the slow, deliberate drawing together of hearts, and the quiet thrill of realizing that two lives had just opened themselves to mine, one word and one gesture at a time. After hours of conversation, a subtle shift occurred. The room, once filled with warm dialogue and soft laughter, now seemed to hold its breath. A quiet pause settled over us, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. The city outside continued its low hum, but inside, time felt suspended. I could feel the change in the air before I even realized it. The way the women's glances lingered just a heartbeat too long, the way our movements unconsciously mirrored each other. The taller woman rested her hand lightly on the edge of the couch, fingers tracing the fabric in absent-minded rhythm. Her gaze flickered toward me and then to the shorter woman, and for a moment, the room felt like a delicate balance of observation and unspoken curiosity. The shorter woman's eyes met mine briefly, a quiet acknowledgement that seemed loaded with meaning, then drifted away, catching a glimmer of candlelight along the rim of her mug. Their presence was magnetic, not in a loud or obvious way, but in a subtle pull, the kind that makes the air itself feel charged. I became acutely aware of my own hesitation. Admiration mixed with an unanticipated tension, curiosity edged with respect, and a fleeting thrill that startled me with its intensity. I could sense their awareness of me, too, the small pauses before they spoke, the way their voices softened in the moments when silence fell. Every glance, every tilt of the head, every barely perceptible shift in posture carried meaning, unspoken yet undeniable. The stillness of the apartment amplified everything. The faint ticking of the wall clock, the soft rustle of fabric as one of them adjusted her position, even the subtle rise and fall of our breaths, each sound became a punctuation in the delicate sentence of the night. I noticed the gentle brush of hair from the taller woman as she leaned slightly to reach for her mug. A shiver ran through me, not from cold, but from the closeness, the intimacy of shared space at such an unguarded hour. Neither of us spoke immediately. The room held a fragile tension, like a string pulled taut but not yet broken. In that silence, emotions spoke more clearly than words ever could. I felt the pull of connection, unspoken, tender, and quietly daring me to recognize it without naming it. My fingers twitched, almost reaching for the warmth of one of their hands resting near mine, yet I held back, respecting the boundary that neither distance nor time had yet crossed. A laugh broke the tension, soft and almost apologetic, as the shorter woman commented on something trivial from earlier in the evening. It was enough to dissolve the heaviness, but only momentarily. The electricity lingered, subtle and persistent, threading through the room like a current we all felt but none dared name aloud. By the time I realized it, the night had transformed. What began as a simple visit had evolved into a delicate dance of closeness and restraint, curiosity and caution, awareness and desire. The silent tension wasn't uncomfortable. It was alive, an invitation to see one another more clearly, to feel one another's presence more deeply, and to acknowledge, without words, that this night was already unlike any other I had known. The night had deepened, and the apartment had grown warmer with our presence, yet there was a subtle chill that made the edges of the room feel more intimate. One of the women, the taller of the two, shivered slightly as she adjusted her scarf. I instinctively rose, fetching a soft blanket from the back of the couch. When I draped it over her shoulders, she looked up at me, eyes soft, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The fabric was warm against her skin, but more than that, it was a gentle acknowledgement, a quiet act of care that said more than words ever could. The shorter woman, noticing the exchange, laughed lightly, the sound delicate and melodic. She reached for the teapot I had left on the table, pouring tea into my mug with a careful hand. Our fingers brushed for a fleeting second, a simple touch, yet electric. The warmth of her hand lingered in my memory, a subtle echo of connection. In that moment, it wasn't about attraction in a dramatic sense. It was about noticing one another, tending to one another's small comforts, and allowing that closeness to grow naturally. We resumed conversation, now tinged with a gentle ease. Topics drifted from work and hobbies to lighter, more personal reflections. The taller woman described a recent book she had found inspiring, her voice animated yet calm. I listened, drawn into her passion for the story, and she leaned slightly toward me, as if inviting me to inhabit the space of her thoughts. Across the couch, the shorter woman adjusted her posture so that her knee brushed mine lightly, unintentional, yet meaningful. I felt the warmth of her proximity, the subtle energy that comes when space and intention align in the quietest of ways. The apartment felt alive with these small gestures, each one weaving a deeper connection. When one of them reached for the sugar bowl, her fingers accidentally brushed mine. We exchanged a brief glance, and a quiet smile passed between us, acknowledging the moment without forcing it into words. Later, the taller woman shifted to sit closer to the edge of the couch, her shoulder brushing mine as she adjusted her blanket. The contact was brief but enough to create a subtle warmth that spread through my chest. Laughter punctuated the evening, a shared joke about the building's creaky stairs, a playful comment about midnight habits. These moments, light and effortless, created a rhythm that felt intimate without overstepping boundaries. Every gesture, every glance, every accidental touch carried meaning, building a tapestry of trust and affection. By the time the clock ticked closer to 2 in the morning, the night had transformed into something quietly profound. What had started as an unexpected knock had become a shared space of care, warmth, and mutual awareness. The subtle physicality, the brushes of hands, the soft touches of blankets, the shared laughter, was a language all its own, one that spoke of understanding, closeness, and the beginning of something neither fully articulated nor consciously pursued. As I poured another cup of tea for myself, I realized that these small acts of care had shifted the atmosphere entirely. The air between us was warmer, heavier with unspoken connection, and alive with a subtle promise that intimacy, in its gentlest and most meaningful form, could thrive in the smallest gestures. The apartment felt quieter now, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Our conversation had drifted from small gestures and shared humor into a deeper, more intimate space. The laughter had softened, replaced by a stillness that was charged, tender, and a little vulnerable. The taller woman's eyes met mine across the dimly lit room, and for a fleeting second, I saw something unguarded, a glimpse of the self she rarely revealed to anyone. "I don't usually open up like this," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that somehow made her look more human, more approachable. "Most days, it feels like you're just going through the motions. Work errands, the same faces, you forget what it feels like to be seen." Her gaze softened, and I realized she was speaking not just to me, but through me, reaching for someone to understand, to witness her truth. The shorter woman shifted slightly, leaning toward me with the faintest trace of nervous energy. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers fidgeting just enough to betray the calm she projected. "Loneliness doesn't always come with drama," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes it's just quiet evenings, watching the world move without you in it, feeling like no one really notices you. Even when people do, it's not the same as being understood." I felt my chest tighten. Their words were not confessions in the dramatic sense. They were subtle, layered admissions of the human need for connection, acknowledgement, and care. I responded honestly, my own voice quieter than usual. "I know what that feels like," I said. "Even when you're surrounded by people, there's this space where you just wish someone would notice the small pieces of you that matter most." A shared silence followed, but it wasn't awkward. It was warm, alive, a delicate space that allowed vulnerability to linger without fear. I could feel the weight of the moment, the closeness amplified by the dim lamplight and the faint scent of their perfume, jasmine, vanilla, and something indefinably personal that seemed to wrap around the room like a soft embrace. Their hands moved subtly. The taller woman's brushed against the edge of my own, deliberately slow, as if measuring whether it was safe to linger. The shorter woman's hand rested lightly on her own knee, then inched closer to mine, a whisper of courage against the tension. Eyes met, and in those long, deliberate looks, there was unspoken understanding, a recognition of shared longing, of emotion neither of us had expected to encounter in a simple midnight visit. I realized then that this night, so ordinary at first, so unexpected, had transformed into something profound. Confession had opened doors, vulnerability had lowered barriers, and in that quiet intimacy, the connection between us became undeniable. There was no rush, no drama, only the weight of honesty, the warmth of presence, and the subtle pull of a bond forming, delicate yet undeniable. By the time we paused to sip our tea, the room hummed with unspoken possibility. Something had shifted irrevocably, a quiet promise suspended in the night, that closeness, care, and the beginning of love could exist in subtle touches, shared stories, and the courage to reveal the fragile pieces of ourselves. The night had deepened into the early hours of dawn. The city outside was hushed, the occasional car passing by sounding like a distant murmur against the stillness of our apartment. Inside, the air felt warmer, charged with quiet intimacy and a subtle glow from the lone lamp that had been our companion all evening. The conversation had slowed, words replaced by the comfortable presence of one another. The tension, once palpable, had softened into something tender, like the lingering warmth of a shared breath. The taller woman adjusted the blanket around her shoulders one last time, and her gaze met mine, steady and soft. There was a fleeting vulnerability in her eyes that mirrored my own, a recognition that something significant had unfolded, unspoken yet deeply understood. The shorter woman leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but her fingers still brushing against mine when we reached simultaneously for the teacup on the table. Even the smallest touches now felt intentional, deliberate, imbued with a quiet affection that made the space between us feel alive. I realized it was time to walk them back to the door. As we rose, the soft scrape of our feet on the wooden floor seemed amplified in the silence. Outside, the hallway was cool, the morning light just beginning to seep into the edges of the building. The taller woman wrapped her scarf a little tighter around her neck, and the shorter one tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, movements that seemed mundane yet carried the weight of all the unspoken connection between us. We stood together for a moment, lingering in the threshold, as if hesitant to break the spell of the night. I could feel the warmth of their presence, subtle yet unmistakable, the quiet steadiness of shared heartbeats in a space that had become theirs and mine simultaneously. The taller woman's hand brushed briefly against my arm, a touch that was gentle, affirming, and intimate in its simplicity. The shorter woman offered a soft smile, her eyes lingering on mine with a depth of understanding and appreciation that words could not capture. "Thank you," the taller one murmured, her voice low, sincere. "For tonight, for listening." The shorter woman nodded, echoing the sentiment without speaking. There was gratitude, yes, but also something more, a recognition of the quiet bond that had formed, a connection that could not be easily untangled or forgotten. As they turned to leave, I noticed the subtle grace in their movements, the way they walked side by side, yet both aware of the closeness we had shared. I stepped back, letting them cross the threshold first, and we shared one last, lingering glance. In that moment, it was clear that the night had changed us all. Strangers who had knocked at midnight had become something more, something meaningful, delicate, and rare. The door closed softly behind them, leaving me in the quiet stillness of the apartment. But the space felt different, warmer, fuller, and alive with the memory of touches, glances, and conversations that had slowly, deliberately, drawn us together. The night had ended, yet the connection remained, suspended like a soft promise in the air. I knew it was not a fleeting encounter, it was a beginning, an unspoken understanding that we had found something extraordinary in the simplest acts of presence, care, and vulnerability. And in that lingering quiet, I felt a smile rise unbidden, a sense of fulfillment, peace, and the subtle thrill of knowing that sometimes, the most profound connections come knocking when you least expect them.